Okay, wonderful. The first question we'd like to ask you, just as an introduction, is could you share a bit about your journey into political science and what drew you into study government, politics, and law?
hmm well, I sort of had a roundabout journey. When I was your age, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do or what I was interested in. I had a lot of sort of similar interests about, questions about how the world works and things like that, but I hadn't narrowed it down to political science. I followed the news very closely. I read a lot. Um, I had sort of an unconventional college experience that was pretty interdisciplinary and introduced me to a lot of different fields and perspectives. And it wasn't until I really started thinking about graduate school that I narrowed it down to political science per se. I moved to New York City to go to graduate school and found that my particular field of interest was political theory, although I am interested in other fields of political science as well, and have become even more sort of interested in those other fields as a professor because I enjoy teaching, a wide range of subjects, not just political theory, but American politics and um, some other topics as well. So I got there sort of by starting really broad in my interests and then getting a little bit narrower over time, and now I'm sort of broadening back out again.
So, as your journey as a professor, what's something you found the most rewarding about teaching in this field?
Um, I guess there's two different ways to answer that question. I mean, I do love working with political science majors who are really passionate about questions of justice or curiosity about how institutions work and those kinds of things. And they come into the classroom and they're ready to jump into it because they've already been thinking about those things. And so that's obviously a lot of fun. But I also really like teaching gen ed classes with students who don't know a lot about political science or politics and maybe think they aren't that interested because I think there's so much room there to help them see how these issues touch their lives every day and to help empower them to think about them more deeply and to recognize how they can sort of insert themselves into some of these processes and recognize and act on their interests.
So, it's kind of nice to teach a diverse perspective.
Absolutely. Mhm.
Mhm. Um, as a professor, why do you think political education is so important for young people today?
Well, I will say that I get a lot of students in the door as freshmen who do not have a very thorough understanding of how our government works, much less how our government compares to other systems around the world. I mean, I think there's just a real um, gap there. And it is in part, I think, because so many schools focus on STEM or they are worried about preparing students for standardized tests or because teachers are worried about opening up political controversies in the classroom. And for all those reasons, I think a lot of students really um, are pretty ignorant about or uninformed, I guess, about how these things work. And so there's a lot of space there for growth and improvement.
Hmm. I think you brought up a really interesting point about how a lot of students aren't informed about US policy compared to other countries. So that being said, are there like common misconceptions you've seen constantly in politics or the judiciary system?
Sure, I can think of one just from my class yesterday. So we've only met twice. It's the very beginning of the semester, but I'm teaching a general education intro to political science class. And we were talking about women in legislatures around the world and the proportion of women and how different countries rank in terms of the proportion of women relative to men. And I asked students to make some guesses and some hypotheses before we looked at the data about how the US ranked compared to other countries. And so, some people thought we'd be in the top 25 or the top 30, maybe the top 50, and we're pretty much right in the middle. We ranked 100 out of 197 countries. And that was really surprising for them, right? That we didn't perform in a particularly impressive way on that metric. Women only make up about a quarter of our legislature at the national level. And I think they were pretty surprised to learn that.
Hmm.
Talking about the national level of politics, a lot of people think that politics only happen at national level. And although we were just discussing global governments, could you also share some examples of how local politics and law could shape daily people's lives?
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the reasons people think about and talk about national politics so much is because so many even local and state level political issues have kind of become nationalized and drawn into these partisan conversations or between Republicans and Democrats, right? Issues that are happening in one place locally get blown up and are sort of portrayed as if they're emblematic of a national issue. And it makes it really hard to separate what's happening at the local level, um, where people belong to political parties and may be very passionate about them, but they also are, I think, a bit more united in terms of wanting to solve local questions and issues, whether it be around public schools or traffic and infrastructure, whatever it may be. I mean, I think there's a lot of unity at the local level that we sometimes don't see because we're used to funneling everything through this idea of hyperpartisanship at the national level.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and I think that brings up a really important point on how understanding local politics is so important to have a united front and kind of get on the same page to build progress in our nation. However, this goes back to what we kind of mentioned earlier about whether or not schools should teach this. So, because it's an ongoing debate on whether or not it's the school's place to teach about civics, how do you think schools and communities could better support civic learning in a way that really empowers students?
I mean, honestly, I think it's the premise that that's not school's place is kind of crazy for me. Um, the whole reason we have public schools is to educate people to become citizens. And to do that, to think that we could do that without civic education is um, is just kind of a silly idea to me. So I think that we can, I would like to see standards across the state and in, some states already have civic standards, but I would like to see a more robust civic education offered to all students. Um, Beyond that, which I think, is maybe more of a heavy lift. I think that civically minded teachers can teach about a lot of these issues without getting mired in controversy and without turning it into, debates or arguments between students, because there's all sorts of things we can learn about how institutions operate and why things happen the way they do that has nothing to do with the way anyone wants to vote when they're in, when they're voting or how their families vote. I mean, it's there's so much more we need to understand beyond that kind of making those personal decisions for ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. How do you think New Jersey does as a state in kind of accomplishing and educating our students about civic education?
I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, I get a pretty wide range when it comes to civics understanding among students. I get some students who've had a semester or maybe even a whole year of civics. They're very well informed when they get here. And I have other students who really haven't even gotten the basics in terms of the three branches of government and checks and balances and things that I consider to be pretty basic. So, there's some inequity there in terms of what is being offered to students.
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm. As you were mentioning, there's a lot of discrepancies in access to information, especially at our school. We live in a pretty well put together area, not that underprivileged. But from your perspective, what barriers would make it harder for underprivileged or underserved communities to access justice or even participate politically?
Well, I think, there is definitely a generational dynamic. Young people whose parents are politically informed and active tend to also get involved and to inform themselves. But if you grew up in an apolitical household or a community where people are not very politically involved, or maybe they feel disempowered by their particular situation, that tends to feed into the next generation. And somebody has to explicitly break that cycle and help people feel less overwhelmed so that they can understand the system and how they can be involved in it. It's politics is hard, right? I mean, it's not if you aren't used to following the news every day, if you don't have people in your life who talk about politics, then it all seems um, intense and unpleasant, right? It's not an easy field to jump into. So you have to have teachers or other sort of community leaders who are going to break that cycle and pull people in and really help them see how they can be involved.
I think in this generation specific, it's great we started identifying systemic barriers that prevent us from getting into an environment where everyone can be equally as involved in politics. However, I think as students continue to fight for having those more equitable system, do you think there's ways even before entering a career in law or government that we can continue to participate in expanding education?
Um, I think I lost the thread a little bit. What exactly are you asking me?
Like, is there a way how students can begin advocating for more equitable systems before they enter careers in law or government?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways. I guess the sort of big picture answer is just by becoming more informed themselves and sort of figuring out what's going on and at that local level, maybe attending school board meetings or town council meetings and starting to talk to people. I think that's one way that you can get out there. It is not unheard of for high school students to um, be members of school boards. You know, it's happened in New Jersey. We had a graduate several years ago who was a member of his school board while he was a high school student. Um, so that's one way to go to those meetings, talk to people, let them know what you would like to see in your curriculum to be different. I believe that Governor Murphy has also been working on some legislation to lower the voting age in New Jersey to 16 on school board elections in particular, as a way to introduce young people to political involvement on an issue that directly affects them. So I think learning about that law and you know advocating for it, I think is another thing young people can do right now. Um, you know, I've heard people say, well, too many young people won't bother getting involved and won't vote in those elections anyway, so it's not worth it to lower the voting age. But I think, you know, there's no better way to learn about politics and to feel sort of the power of your own voice and sort of joining your voice collectively with other people than by participating. And I think that's a great way to do it.
Yeah. I totally agree. I feel like definitely lowering the voting age will kind of give an incentive to a lot more high school students to learn more about politics because I feel like a lot of them right now aren't as keen to learn about politics because they know that they can't vote in a while and it seems more of like a later issue, except all issues like affecting our government and our people currently. Given this, there's a lot of students like me and Jasmine who are really interested in going into politics or law. And we were wondering if there are like any books, thinkers, or resources that you would recommend for students, especially to just deepen their understanding of politics.
Um, I think I would probably recommend a regular newspaper subscription over a book,
Hmm.
honestly. I mean, there's a million of good books out there, you know, and depending on someone's particular interests, I could help guide you in that direction. But I think the best step anyone can take to getting more involved in politics is to read a news source every day or to subscribe to, you know, a news podcast or a reputable news source, not like the stuff that pops up on Instagram or TikTok, but like a real reputable news organization's output every day. And just sort of get yourself into the habit of seeing what's happening in the world every day. And, you know, if you listen to something like NPR, it's going to include a lot of local news as well and help you stay informed at that level too.
I think you brought up a really interesting point about how you should go to a reputable news outlet. I know specifically in me and Vatsala's age group, a lot of people get their information from social media. And it's a flip side of a coin because, yes, it's an easy way to spread information. But that being said, it can also cause issues of credibility. So,
Mhm.
how do you think social media or technology in general has specifically affected the field of political science?
Well, I mean, like every part of modern life, it has been a double-edged sword. I mean, it has helped in some ways to democratize information, but from my perspective, the larger effect has been um, the spread of slop and misinformation and disinformation. Um, of course, all of the reputable news organizations have TikTok channels and post videos on social media, right? But like it's all interspersed and mixed up with stuff that is of really varying credibility. Um, and if you don't already have some background, then you don't know how to parse it all out. Which is why I really try to insist that students get a newspaper subscription. And there's lots of opportunities to get student subscriptions that are a little cheaper, through your school or organization. Like you can get a New York Times subscription that's a lot less than a normal subscription.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think a big thing with social media too is there tends to be a lot of bias, and it tends to prey upon those who aren't as readily educated in political science. So do you think it's mainly people who aren't as informed who fall victim to this misinformation, or do you see students in your own class kind of believing these misconceptions?
Um, if you are, you know, low information, uninformed, you are certainly susceptible to misinformation and disinformation. But anyone um, can fall prey to misinformation if it happens to um, sort of confirm something you already think is true about the world. We tend to be a little less um, critical in our reading skills if something affirms a feeling we already had. So, and that can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter how smart they are or how informed they are. They can do that if they're not on their guard, right? They can fall victim to that kind of information. So being vigilant and really interrogating the sources that you're looking at to make sure that they're reliable is important for everyone. It's not just for those who are sort of less informed about politics.
Hmm. As we're closing off, we'd like to ask you a final question. It's looking ahead, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for strengthening democracy in the next decade?
I think the biggest thing that I would say to your generation right now, the most important thing is for people to start paying attention.
Hmm.
We still see vastly lower voting rates among young people. The oldest demographic, 65 and older, always has the highest voting rate. And they don't necessarily have the same interests as your generation. And so the thing I would love to see the most is for young people um, to demand that education, to inform themselves if no one else is going to give it to them, and to just pay attention to what's happening in their communities, their state, their country, and around the world as much as they can, and hold their leaders to account if they don't like what they see.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure Jasmine can agree, like all of your insights and answers are really, really helpful. And we're really looking forward to like sharing all this information with students from our school.
That's great. Will it be possible for you to share the final result with
Yeah,
me
of
as
course.
well?
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, it was nice to meet you both.
Nice to
Thank
meet
you. It
you.
was great meeting you.
Take care.
Thank you.